Nobody in that ballroom knew the woman scrubbing burnt sauce off silver platters had signed the lease on the building 3 years ago. Nobody knew that the man who owned the hotel, the caterers, the flowers, even the ice sculptures melting under the chandeliers, was her husband. And nobody, especially not Lady Genevieve, had any idea that by midnight, every single person laughing at Romilly Windrow would be begging for her mercy. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, Romilly just wanted to disappear. The Grand Regent Hotel's ballroom glittered like something out of a magazine. Crystal chandeliers threw soft gold light across 300 guests, dressed in silk and diamonds, all gathered for the Windrow Foundation's annual charity gala. Romilly stood near the entrance in a simple navy dress, her curves straining slightly against the fabric, feeling every inch of the space between her and the beautiful people around her. "Oh, look who decided to show up." Lady Genevieve's voice cut through the string quartet music like a blade. She glided over in a gown that probably cost more than Romilly's mother's entire funeral, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. The little charity case herself. Romilly's spine stiffened, but she kept her voice even. "Genevieve, I was invited." "Invited?" Genevieve laughed, loud enough that heads turned. "Sweetheart, you were invited because someone felt sorry for you. Look at you, squeezed into that dress like a sausage in its casing, standing here like you belong with real people." A few nearby guests chuckled. Romilly felt her cheeks burn, but she didn't move. She'd learned long ago that reacting only fed people like Genevieve. That composure seemed to infuriate Genevieve further. She snapped her fingers at a passing waiter and yanked a stained apron off his tray, thrusting it against Romilly's chest, hard enough to make her stumble back a step. "You want to be here so badly? Fine. Earn your place." Genevieve's eyes glittered with cruelty. "The kitchen needs someone on dishes tonight. Real help called in sick. Go make yourself useful, or I swear I will make sure every donor in this room knows exactly what kind of family you really come from." The threat landed exactly where it was meant to. Romilly's mother had built her name on dignity, on the shelter she'd founded with her bare hands, on decades of quiet, hard work, helping women who had nowhere else to go. Romilly would not let Genevieve drag that name through the mud over something as small as pride. She took the apron. "Good girl," Genevieve purred, already turning back to her circle of admirers, her laughter trailing behind her like poison perfume. The kitchen was a different world entirely. Steam rose in thick clouds from industrial sinks, the air thick with the smell of grease and bleach. Romilly tied the apron around her waist and got to work, her hands moving through soapy water while upstairs, string quartets played for people who would never think to wonder who she really was. But Romilly hadn't come to that gala by accident, and she certainly hadn't accepted the apron out of weakness. Weeks ago, she had learned that somewhere in this hotel, tucked behind the old service corridors, sat an archive room that still held decades of the hotel's financial records. Records that included her late mother's original foundation pledge files, the ones that had mysteriously vanished right around the time Genevieve's family had started circling the shelter like vultures. Romilly needed those files. She needed proof, and the dish pit, disgusting as it was, sat directly behind the archive room's back entrance. She waited until the kitchen staff shifted toward the main service line, distracted by a dessert course gone wrong. Then she slipped through a narrow gap behind the dish rack, her heart hammering, and found herself in a dim, forgotten corridor lined with locked doors. The archive room door had an old brass lock, the kind installed decades before anyone bothered with keycards. Romilly reached up and pulled a bobby pin from her hair, her fingers steady despite the pounding in her chest. Her grandmother had taught her this trick years ago, half as a joke, never imagining her granddaughter would actually need it. The lock clicked open on the third try. Inside, dust-coated rows of filing cabinets. But Romilly moved with purpose, scanning labels until her fingers found a folder marked Windrow Foundation, Original Pledges. Her hands trembled as she opened it. There, in her mother's careful handwriting, were the original signatures, the true numbers, everything Genevieve's family had buried under years of forged paperwork. She had found it. But as she tucked the folder against her chest and turned to leave, a shadow shifted at the far end of the corridor. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed off the concrete walls. Someone had followed her, and whoever it was already knew exactly where to look. Romilly froze, the folder clutched tight against her chest, her back pressed to the cold filing cabinet. The footsteps grew louder, unhurried, almost lazy, like whoever it was already knew she had nowhere to run. A tall man in a black suit stepped into the doorway, blocking the only exit. She recognized him instantly. Marcus Vale, Genevieve's chief of security, a man with a reputation for making problems disappear quietly. "Miss Windrow." His voice was calm, almost polite, which somehow made it worse. "Lady Genevieve wondered where you'd wandered off to. Dish duty doesn't usually involve breaking and entering." "I didn't break anything," Romilly said, forcing steel into her voice even as her pulse roared in her ears. "This building holds public records. I have every right to see them." Marcus's eyes flicked to the folder in her arms. "That's not for you to decide." He took a step forward, his hand extending. "Hand it over, and we forget this ever happened." Romilly's mind raced. If she gave up the folder, she lost the only proof that could save her mother's shelter. If she didn't, she had no idea what a man like Marcus was capable of in an empty corridor with no witnesses. She backed toward the far door, the one leading to the service exit and the underground parking garage. "I'm leaving. You can tell Genevieve whatever you want." That wasn't a request. Marcus's tone hardened, and two more men in dark suits appeared behind him, filling the narrow hallway. Romilly ran. Her heels clattered against concrete as she shoved through the service exit door, the folder pressed to her chest like a shield. Cold night air hit her face, thick with the smell of exhaust and rain. The underground parking garage stretched out ahead of her, rows of sleek cars parked under flickering fluorescent lights, shadows pooling in every corner. "Get her," Marcus barked behind her, and suddenly there were footsteps everywhere, closing in from multiple directions. Romilly's legs burned as she cut between two parked cars, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. A hand grabbed her wrist, wrenching her backward, and she cried out as her shoulder slammed against a concrete pillar. "Give it here," one of the guards snarled, twisting her arm. And then, headlights. Bright, sudden, cutting through the dim garage like daylight. An engine roared, tires screeching against concrete, and a black armored sedan swung around the corner, with three more vehicles trailing close behind. Doors flew open before the cars even fully stopped, and men in tactical gear moved with a precision that made Genevieve's security team look like amateurs. The guard holding Romilly's wrist let go so fast she stumbled, and within seconds, Marcus and his men were surrounded, weapons drawn, retreating with their hands raised, cursing under their breath. Romilly stood frozen in the chaos, her wrist throbbing, the folder still somehow clutched against her chest, when a car door opened directly beside her. "Get in!" The voice was low, controlled, carrying an authority that made every single guard in that garage go still. Romilly turned and found herself looking up into the face of her husband. Ajax Windrow didn't look like a man who belonged at a charity gala. His dark suit was impeccable, but there was something coiled and dangerous beneath the surface, something the tailored fabric couldn't quite hide. His jaw was tight, his eyes scanning the garage with the kind of focus that made grown men flinch, before finally settling on her. "Romilly." His voice softened instantly, the fury draining from his expression the moment their eyes met. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, though her wrist said otherwise. "I'm fine. Get in the car," he said again, gentler this time, already reaching for her hand. She climbed into the armored sedan on shaking legs, and Ajax slid in beside her, pulling the door shut behind them. The moment the locks clicked, the tension in her chest finally broke, and her hands started trembling uncontrollably. Ajax noticed immediately. Without a word, he shrugged off his suit jacket and wrapped it gently around her shoulders, his fingers brushing carefully over the darkening bruise already forming on her wrist. His touch was soft, almost reverent, a stark contrast to the ice in his eyes just moments ago. "Who did this to you?" he asked quietly, though something in his tone told her he already knew the answer. "Genevieve's security," Romilly whispered. "I was in the archive room. I found my mother's original pledge files. Someone must have known I'd go looking." Ajax's jaw tightened, a muscle ticking beneath his skin. He glanced down at the folder, still clutched in her lap, and for a brief moment, something unreadable flickered across his face. Not surprise, not anger, recognition. "Ajax?" Romilly asked, catching it. "What is it?" He looked up, and just as quickly, the expression vanished, replaced by careful calm. "Nothing," he said, pulling her closer against his side as the car pulled out of the garage into the rain-soaked night. "You're safe now, that's all that matters." But Romilly couldn't shake the feeling that whatever flicker of recognition had crossed her husband's face, it meant he already knew far more about those missing files than he was letting on. Romilly barely slept that night. She kept replaying the flicker of recognition on Ajax's face, the way his jaw had tightened at the sight of her mother's folder, the way he'd changed the subject so smoothly she almost hadn't noticed. Almost. By morning, she pushed the thought aside. There would be time to ask questions later. Right now, she needed to get to St. Jude's Women's Shelter and confirm what the pledge files actually proved. The shelter sat on a quiet corner in the East District, a converted brick building her mother had bought with her own savings 20 years ago. Romilly had grown up in these halls, folding donated blankets. The place still smelled like her mother, like lavender soap and old wood polish, even years after her passing. She stepped out of the car that morning, expecting quiet. Instead, she found chaos. 2 bulldozers idled at the curb, their engines growling low and steady. A cluster of men in hard hats stood near the front steps, papers in hand, while a woman in a sharp business suit argued loudly with the shelter's elderly caretaker, Mrs. Alden. "This is a legally binding eviction notice," the woman was saying, thrusting a clipboard toward Mrs. Alden's chest. "The property has been sold. You have until noon to clear the residents out." "Sold?" Mrs. Alden's voice cracked with disbelief. "This shelter has never been for sale. 20 women live here. Where exactly do you expect them to go?" Romilly's blood ran cold. She pushed through the small crowd gathering on the sidewalk, her folder still tucked safely in her bag from the night before. "What is going on here?" The woman in the suit turned, unbothered. "And you are?" "Romilly Windrow. This is my mother's shelter." "Was your mother's shelter," the woman corrected coolly. "The property was legally transferred and sold 6 months ago. We're simply executing the new owner's instructions." She flipped a page on her clipboard. "The Ashcroft Group has plans to redevelop this lot into luxury condominiums. Demolition begins today." Romilly felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. Genevieve's maiden name was Ashcroft. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a plan, months in the making, executed while Romilly had been distracted with galas and dish pits. "You can't do this," Romilly said, stepping directly between the woman and the shelter's front doors. "This transfer is fraudulent. I have proof." The woman's smile turned pitying, the kind reserved for people she assumed had already lost. "You have until noon. After that, we start clearing the building whether you're standing there or not." Romilly didn't move. Behind her, she could hear the soft, frightened voices of the women inside, peering out from curtained windows, unsure what was happening to the only safe place many of them had left. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and called the one number she trusted completely. Ajax picked up on the second ring. "Romilly? They're trying to demolish the shelter," she said, her voice cracking despite her best efforts to stay calm. "Genevieve's family sold it, Ajax. They're bulldozing it today, right now, and there are women inside who have nowhere else to go." There was a brief pause on the other end, and when Ajax spoke again, his voice had shifted into something sharp and immovable. "Don't let them touch that building. I'm sending my legal team now. Stall them, Romilly. Whatever it takes." The line went dead, and Romilly slid the phone back into her pocket, turning to face the bulldozer operators who were already revving their engines, waiting for the signal. She walked forward and planted herself directly in front of the nearest machine, arms crossed, chin lifted, despite the fear curling tight in her stomach. "Ma'am, you need to move," one of the workers called out, uncertain, glancing toward his supervisor for direction. "No," Romilly said simply, "I won't." The woman in the suit checked her watch, clearly irritated. "This is trespassing. I could have you arrested." "Then arrest me," Romilly shot back, standing firmer. "But you'll do it on camera, in front of every woman and person inside that building, and I promise you, the story will not paint your company in a flattering light." Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity. The bulldozer engines idled, growling like impatient beasts, while Mrs. Alden gathered the shelter's residents inside, keeping them calm, keeping them together. Romilly's arms began to shake from holding her position, sweat gathering at her temples despite the cool morning air, but she refused to step aside. Just as the woman in the suit finally snapped her fingers, ordering the operators to proceed regardless, a convoy of sleek black cars screeched around the corner, sirens briefly flashing before cutting off. Ajax's legal team spilled out, led by a sharp-eyed lawyer clutching a thick stack of documents. "Emergency injunction," the lawyer announced, holding the papers high enough for everyone to see. "Signed by Judge Harmon, not 20 minutes ago. This property's sale is under formal investigation for fraud. Any demolition proceeds today, and every person on this crew faces federal obstruction charges." The woman in the suit's face went pale. The bulldozer operators exchanged uneasy glances before slowly, reluctantly, cutting their engines. Romilly finally allowed herself to breathe, her legs nearly giving out beneath her. Mrs. Alden rushed to her side, gripping her hand tightly, tears of relief streaming down her weathered face. But as the crowd began to disperse, Romilly caught sight of something that made her stomach twist all over again. Tucked into the corner of the fraudulent sale document, still clutched in the woman's hand, barely visible, was a signature she recognized instantly. It wasn't Genevieve's. It was her own husband's company letterhead, stamped on paperwork dated months before she'd even known the shelter was in danger. The drive back to Windrow Estate passed in silence. Romilly stared out the window. The image of that letterhead burned into her mind. The name of her husband's holding company, stamped onto a document meant to steal her mother's shelter out from under her. She didn't confront him in the car. She waited until they reached the estate, until the gravel crunched beneath the tires and the old glass house came into view at the edge of the garden, its glass panels catching the soft afternoon light. Ajax found her there an hour later, sitting on the wooden bench among his mother's roses, her hands still raw and trembling from the morning's ordeal. He knelt in front of her without a word and gently took her hands in his, examining the small cuts and bruises with a tenderness that made her chest ache. "I saw your name," she said quietly, before he could speak. "On the sale documents. Cascade Holdings. That's your company, Ajax." His hands stilled. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Romilly's heart sank, certain the silence itself was confession enough. It was, he finally admitted, his voice low. A shell entity I acquired over a year ago. I've been buying pieces of Genevieve's network, quietly, one holding company at a time, long before I knew she'd touch the shelter. I didn't authorize that sale, Romilly. Someone inside her syndicate used old paperwork bearing my company's name to make the transfer look legitimate. I found out the same moment your lawyer called me. How am I supposed to believe that? Her voice cracked. Exhaustion and fear finally breaking through the composure she'd held onto all day. Everywhere I turn, there's another secret. Another thing you knew and didn't tell me. Ajax's jaw tightened, pain flashing behind his eyes. Because I was trying to protect you. There are things about my world, about the people I deal with, that I never wanted anywhere near you. I don't need protecting, Romilly snapped, pulling her hands back. I need honesty. He rose slowly, running a hand through his hair, and for the first time since she'd known him, Romilly saw something close to fear in her husband's expression. Not fear of Genevieve, or her syndicate, or anything dangerous waiting outside these walls. Fear of her. Do you know why I married you? He asked quietly. The question caught her off guard. Because, she faltered, because we agreed it made sense. My mother's shelter needed protection. Your position needed stability. It was practical. That's what I told myself too, Ajax said, his voice rough. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being practical for me. And every single day since, I've wondered if it ever stopped being practical for you. Or if you're still just here because I'm the only wall standing between you and people like Genevieve. Romilly stared at him, stunned into silence. In all their months of marriage, careful and formal and built on convenience, she had never once heard him speak like this, stripped of the composure he wore like armor. Ajax, I watch you fight for that shelter with everything you have, he continued, his voice unsteady now. I watch you stand in front of bulldozers and pick locks and run through parking garages, and I keep asking myself the same question. If I disappeared tomorrow, if I lost everything, would you still choose to stay? The words lodged themselves deep in her chest, and Romilly found herself unable to answer, not because she didn't know the truth, but because saying it out loud suddenly felt like the most terrifying thing she'd ever done. She opened her mouth, searching for the right words, for anything that could bridge the sudden, aching distance between them. She started, her voice barely a whisper. I do love you, Ajax. I have for longer than I've been willing to admit. But every time I try to say it, it feels like it isn't enough, like you deserve more proof than words. Something shifted in his expression, the fear softening into something rawer, more vulnerable. He reached for her again, his thumb brushing gently against her cheek, and for one suspended moment, the entire world outside the glass house seemed to fall away. Then his phone buzzed sharply against the glass table beside them, shattering the fragile silence. Ajax hesitated, clearly reluctant to break the moment, but the buzzing continued, insistent. He finally reached for it, and the second his eyes scanned the screen, his entire posture changed, tension snapping back into his shoulders like a drawn bowstring. What is it? Romilly asked, alarm creeping back into her voice. It's my financial team. Ajax's expression darkened as he read further. Genevieve's moving money. Fast. She's liquidating the Foundation's offshore accounts as we speak, transferring everything into untraceable holdings. Romilly felt the warmth of the moment evaporate instantly, replaced by cold, familiar dread. She's cutting her losses. She knows we found proof. Ajax's eyes met hers, sharp and resolute once more, the vulnerable man from moments ago folding back beneath the armor of the man who ran an empire. Then we move faster than she does. He stood, offering his hand to pull her up from the bench. Get dressed. We're going to the courthouse first thing tomorrow morning, and we're doing this publicly, where she can't hide behind lawyers and closed doors." Romilly took his hand, her fingers lacing through his, the unfinished conversation between them hanging heavy in the air. But as they walked back toward the estate together, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Ajax had almost said in that glass house mattered just as much as the war now closing in around them. The financial district courthouse rose against the gray morning sky like a fortress of marble and glass, its steps already crowded with reporters by the time Ajax's car pulled up at 8 o'clock sharp. Romilly's stomach twisted at the sight of the cameras, but she reminded herself why they were there. Somewhere inside that building sat a judge with the power to freeze every asset Genevieve was trying to hide. "Stay close to me," Ajax murmured as they stepped out of the car, his hand finding the small of her back. "Whatever she says out here, don't react." That's exactly what she wants. Romilly nodded, clutching the folder of pledge files against her chest like armor. They climbed the courthouse steps together, flanked by two of Ajax's lawyers, moving quickly toward the entrance. They almost made it inside. Well, well. Genevieve's voice rang out across the plaza, sharp and theatrical, timed perfectly for the cameras already swiveling in her direction. She emerged from a silver car parked at the curb, dressed in flawless white, looking every bit the wronged philanthropist she intended to portray. "Look who's decided to drag our family disagreements into the public eye." Reporters surged forward instantly, microphones thrust toward Romilly's face, questions overlapping in a chaotic wall of noise. Ajax's grip tightened protectively around her waist, but Genevieve was already moving, positioning herself directly in the camera's line of sight, her expression carefully arranged into practiced heartbreak. "This woman," Genevieve said, gesturing toward Romilly with a trembling hand, "married into wealth, and now claims my family stole from a charity my late husband helped fund for years. She's using grief, using her mother's memory, to extort money from a legitimate foundation. It's disgraceful." "That's not what happened," Romilly said, her voice steady despite the cameras flashing around her. "I have documentation proving the shelter's ownership was fraudulently transferred using forged signatures. Documentation you conveniently found after breaking into a private archive." Genevieve shot back, her voice rising with practiced outrage. "Tell me, Romilly, does theft run in the family, or is it something you picked up recently?" A ripple of murmurs moved through the gathered reporters, pens scratching furiously against notepads. Romilly felt heat rush to her face, humiliation and fury tangled together, but she forced herself to stand tall, remembering Ajax's warning. React, and she loses. "The archive room held public hotel records," Romilly said clearly, projecting her voice toward the cameras rather than toward Genevieve. "Records that prove your family altered legal pledge documents belonging to my mother's foundation. I'm not the one who should be answering questions about theft." Genevieve's composed mask flickered for just a moment, a flash of genuine anger cracking through the performance, before she smoothed it over. "You have no idea what you're accusing me of." "Don't I?" Romilly stepped forward, despite Ajax's restraining hand, adrenaline burning away the last of her fear. "You forced me into a dish pit at your own gala, because you couldn't stand the sight of a woman who didn't fit your idea of who belongs at your events. You had your security corner me in a service tunnel, and now your people showed up with bulldozers at a shelter housing 20 women, using forged ownership papers with my husband's old company name stamped on them to make it look legitimate." Cameras clicked rapidly, capturing every word. Genevieve's eyes darted briefly toward the crowd, calculating, before her expression twisted into something colder. "Careful," she said quietly, her voice dropping just low enough that only Romilly and Ajax could hear it, beneath the noise of the reporters. "You're playing a game you don't understand, sweetheart. My family didn't build an empire by losing gracefully. Neither did mine, Ajax said, stepping fully beside Romilly for the first time, his voice carrying an authority that instantly silenced the surrounding chatter. He faced the cameras directly, calm and controlled. The Windrow Foundation formally requests an emergency judicial review of all asset transfers connected to the Ashcroft family's holdings over the past 18 months. We have submitted documentation to the court this morning, and we welcome full transparency in this investigation. The reporters erupted into a fresh wave of shouted questions, but Ajax simply guided Romilly past Genevieve and up the remaining courthouse steps, his lawyers falling into step behind them. Genevieve stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling in real time under the weight of Ajax's calm, public counterattack. Inside, once the heavy courthouse doors shut behind them and the noise faded into muffled echoes, Romilly finally allowed herself to exhale, her hands shaking as the adrenaline began to drain away. "You did well out there," Ajax said quietly, steadying her with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "She's not going to stop," Romilly said, staring at the closed doors behind them. "Not after that." "No," Ajax agreed grimly. "She's not, which means we can't give her the chance to regroup." Before Romilly could respond, one of Ajax's lawyers approached quickly, his expression tight with urgency, phone already extended toward them. "Sir, you need to see this," he said. "Our surveillance team just flagged unusual activity around the safe house property in Old Town. Someone's been asking questions about your residence, ma'am. We think Genevieve already knows exactly where you'll be sleeping tonight." Ajax's expression darkened instantly, the brief calm from the courthouse steps evaporating. "Then we move again," he said, already reaching for Romilly's hand. "Tonight, before she gets there first." By nightfall, Windrow Estate had turned into a media circus. News vans lined the gates, reporters shouting questions at the security guards, drones buzzing overhead, trying to catch a glimpse through the windows. Ajax made the call before dinner, his voice clipped and final. "We're not staying here tonight." They left through a service road at the back of the property. Romilly tucked into the back of an unmarked car with tinted windows, Ajax beside her, scanning his phone for updates from his security team. Within the hour, they arrived at a converted warehouse loft on the waterfront, in Old Town Port. Its exterior unremarkable, its interior fortified with security systems Romilly hadn't even known existed. "Nobody outside my inner circle knows this place exists," Ajax explained as they stepped inside, steel shutters sliding shut behind them with a heavy, reassuring thud. "We'll be safe here while we work." The loft's main floor had been transformed into something closer to a command center than a home. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the dark water outside, but the real activity centered around a long table cluttered with laptops, printed spreadsheets, and 3 of Ajax's financial analysts already hard at work when they arrived. "Miss Windrow, sir," a sharp-eyed woman named Priya stood as they entered, gesturing toward the table. "We've been cross-referencing the pledge files against the Ashcroft financial records you sent over. You need to see this." Romilly set the folder down, her mother's careful handwriting catching the light one last time, before Priya spread the original pledge documents beside a stack of printed bank statements. For the next hour, Romilly watched as the analysts worked methodically, tracing numbers across pages, circling discrepancies, building a picture piece by piece. "Here," Priya tapped a column of figures. "Your mother's original pledge files show donations totaling just under $2 million, all designated specifically for the shelter's operating costs and mortgage. But look at the Ashcroft Group's internal ledgers from the same period." Romilly leaned forward, scanning the numbers. The donation amounts matched exactly, dollar for dollar, but the destination accounts were completely different from anything associated with the shelter. "They rerouted it," Romilly said slowly, understanding dawning cold and heavy in her chest. The donations came in under my mother's name, but the money never actually reached the shelter. It gets worse, another analyst added, pulling up a spreadsheet on his laptop screen. We traced the rerouted funds through 4 shell companies before they landed in offshore accounts, registered to venues across the city. Ballrooms, event spaces, hotels, including the Grand Regent, where you worked the Gala. Ajax's expression turned grim as he studied the screen. She's been laundering charitable donations through her own venue leases for years, using genuine foundation money to make her business empire look legitimate, then skimming profits back out through inflated lease agreements. So the eviction at St. Jude's wasn't just about land value, Romilly said, piecing it together. She needed the shelter gone because our audit would have exposed the exact accounts she'd been funneling money through. Exactly. Priya nodded, pulling up one final document. And this is the part you really need to see. She turned her laptop toward Romilly, displaying a lease agreement dated 8 years earlier, the signature at the bottom instantly recognizable. Romilly's breath caught. "That's my mother's signature," she whispered, staring at the page. "But she never signed a lease with Genevieve's family. She would have told me. She might not have known what she was actually signing," Ajax said quietly, studying the document over her shoulder. "Look at the header. This isn't a shelter lease. It's a venue partnership agreement, buried inside routine paperwork for the annual charity gala your mother used to help organize alongside Genevieve's late husband." Realization crashed over Romilly like ice water. Genevieve's husband and my mother worked together before Genevieve ever took over the family business. And when he died, Ajax continued, his voice hardening, Genevieve inherited control of every venue and lease connected to that partnership, including whatever loophole let her legally launder donation money through them for the past decade. Your mother's shelter was never just a target. It was the missing piece connecting the entire operation together. Romilly sank into the nearest chair, her hands trembling as she pressed her palms flat against the table. She's been stealing from women who had nowhere else to go for years, and using my mother's own signature to make it look legal. Ajax knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "This is enough evidence to bury her, Romilly. Not just civil charges. This is federal money laundering, tied directly to charitable fraud. If we present this correctly, she won't just lose the shelter dispute. She'll lose everything," Romilly finished, something fierce and steady settling into her chest for the first time all day. A sharp beeping suddenly cut through the room, red lights flashing across the security panel mounted near the entrance. Priya's head snapped up instantly, her fingers flying across her keyboard. "Sir, we have a breach," she said, alarm sharpening her voice. "Motion sensors on the ground floor. Loading dock. Someone's trying to get in." Ajax rose immediately, his entire demeanor shifting into something colder, more controlled. He crossed to the security panel, eyes scanning the camera feed, showing 3 figures moving cautiously through the shadows below. "Genevieve found us faster than I expected," he said quietly, before turning to Romilly, his expression unreadable. "Stay here. Lock the doors behind me." But as he moved toward the stairwell, Romilly stood up too, her fear giving way to something harder, something that refused to sit quietly upstairs, while danger crept toward the people trying to help her. "No," she said firmly, reaching for the tablet controlling the loft's security system. "I'm not hiding this time. I know exactly how to trap them right where they are." Ajax stopped mid-stride, turning back to face her, something between alarm and disbelief flashing across his face. "Romilly, there's no time to argue about this." "Then don't argue," she said, already swiping through security menus on the tablet, her fingers steadier than she expected. "This building isn't just fortified. Priya showed me the blueprints earlier. Every loading dock door feeds into a single corridor before it reaches the stairwell. If I seal the interior gate here, she tapped the screen, highlighting a section of the floor plan. Whoever's down there gets trapped between two steel doors with nowhere to go. You don't need to be down there to stop them. You need to be somewhere far more useful. Priya leaned over the tablet, studying the layout, and nodded slowly. She's right. The corridor's a dead end once both gates close. We can hold them there until authorities arrive. No direct confrontation necessary. Ajax hesitated, torn between the instinct to protect her physically and the recognition that she wasn't wrong. Finally, he exhaled sharply, crossing the room to grip her shoulders. You seal that gate the second they're inside. You don't go down there yourself. Promise me. I promise, Romilly said, and meant it. Ajax turned to Priya. Get the authorities moving now. Quietly. No sirens until they're in position. I need eyes on this feed at all times. He looked back at Romilly one final time, something unspoken passing between them, before pulling on his jacket. I have somewhere else to be tonight. If Genevieve's desperate enough to send people after us directly, it means she knows exactly how much danger she's in. Which means it's time to finish this properly. Where are you going? Romilly asked. To make sure she has nothing left to fight with, Ajax said grimly, and then he was gone, disappearing down a separate exit with two of his security team trailing close behind. What followed was the longest night of Romilly's life. She sat hunched over the security tablet, watching grainy camera feeds as three shadowy figures crept through the loading dock below, testing doors, searching for a way in. Her heart pounded as she waited, finger hovering over the gate control, until finally all three men stepped fully into the corridor. She sealed the gate. The clang of steel doors locking into place echoed up through the building's frame, followed almost immediately by muffled shouting and pounding fists against unyielding metal. Romilly watched the feed, her breathing shallow, until flashing red and blue lights finally appeared on the loading dock camera 20 minutes later, local police moving in to take the trapped men into custody. She sank back into her chair, adrenaline finally draining from her body, leaving her hollow and exhausted. Priya squeezed her shoulder gently. You did well. Genevieve just lost 3 more men she can't afford to lose. But Romilly's mind was already elsewhere, wondering exactly what Ajax meant when he said he had somewhere else to be. She got her answer at dawn. Ajax returned to the loft just as sunlight began breaking pale gold across the water outside. His tie loosened, exhaustion etched into every line of his face, but his eyes carried something fierce and satisfied that Romilly hadn't seen in days. It's done, he said simply, dropping into the chair across from her. What's done? Every debt, every mortgage, every venue lease connected to Genevieve's syndicate. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, weariness giving way to something colder. I spent the entire night meeting with municipal officials and every lender holding paper on her properties. Cascade Holdings now owns 100% of it. Every ballroom, every event space, every mortgage payment she owes on the Ashcroft empire, it all belongs to me now. Romilly stared at him, stunned. How is that even possible? That's not something you do overnight. It's something you do overnight if you've spent the last year quietly positioning yourself to do exactly this, Ajax admitted. I started buying pieces of her network months before I ever knew about your mother's shelter. I suspected something wasn't right with her finances long before the fraud came to light. Last night simply forced my hand faster than I planned. Understanding settled slowly over Romilly, layered with a strange mixture of relief and unease. You've been planning this for months, before we even got married. Something guarded flickered in Ajax's expression. Romilly, I need you to understand something. When I married you, it wasn't purely about protecting your mother's foundation from a distance. There were things happening long before that gala, things involving Genevieve's family and mine, older debts and older grudges I never fully explained. Romilly's stomach tightened. What kind of debts? Ajax's jaw tensed, and for the first time since she'd known him, she watched her husband, a man who commanded rooms and controlled empires with a single word, struggle to find the courage to speak. Genevieve's late husband, he said finally, quietly, was the man who destroyed my father's business 20 years ago. And your mother was the only person who ever tried to stop him. Romilly stared at her husband, the weight of his words settling over her like a stone. My mother tried to stop him. Ajax, why would you never tell me that? Because I didn't know how, he admitted, running a hand through his hair. 20 years ago, my father built a shipping company from nothing. Genevieve's husband forced him out through the same kind of fraud we've spent this past week uncovering. Fake leases, rerouted funds, forged signatures. My father lost everything. He died 2 years later, broken and ashamed, convinced he'd failed our family. And my mother? Your mother was one of the only people who believed him, Ajax said quietly. She testified on his behalf during the civil case, even though it cost her donors and put her own reputation at risk. It didn't save the company, but it saved what was left of my father's name. I never forgot that. I spent years building Cascade Holdings with one goal in mind, to make sure a family like Genevieve's never destroyed anyone else the way they destroyed mine. Romilly sat in stunned silence, pieces of the last week rearranging themselves into an entirely different shape. Their marriage hadn't been random convenience at all. It had been rooted in something far older, something Ajax had carried quietly for years, hidden beneath careful business decisions and calculated distance. She didn't get the chance to respond before Ajax excused himself to shower and change before their final meeting with the legal team, leaving Romilly alone in the loft with her thoughts spinning in slow, uneasy circles. They returned to Windrow Estate 2 days later, once security confirmed the media crowds had finally dispersed. That morning, while Ajax met privately with his lawyers in the study, Romilly wandered the quiet halls, restless, still turning over everything he'd told her. She found herself standing outside his study, the door left slightly ajar, an old wooden drawer built into the built-in bookshelf pulled halfway open, clearly disturbed during his search for case files. Curiosity, and something deeper she couldn't quite name, pulled her inside. The drawer held stacks of paper, older than the rest of his organized files, edges worn soft from handling. Romilly hesitated only a moment before lifting the first folder free. Her breath caught. Medical invoices, dozens of them spanning years, all addressed to St. Jude's Women's Shelter, all marked paid in full by an account she didn't recognize. Beneath them, receipts for building repairs, heating system replacements, even payroll covered during months the shelter's donations had fallen short. Every single payment traced back to the same anonymous holding account, one Romilly now recognized instantly as an early, obscure branch of Cascade Holdings, established years before she and Ajax had ever officially met. Her hands trembled as she kept turning pages, watching a pattern emerge that stretched back nearly a decade. Her mother's medical bills during her final illness quietly settled in full. The shelter's mortgage, paid down steadily every single month, long before Genevieve's family had ever circled it as a target. Ajax had been protecting her family long before she'd known his name. She was still sitting on the study floor, papers scattered around her, when Ajax returned and found her there. He froze in the doorway, his expression shifting rapidly from surprise to something far more vulnerable. "Romilly, you've been doing this for years," she said, her voice thick with emotion, holding up one of the invoices. "Before we ever met, before any of this started, you paid for my mother's treatment." You kept the shelter afloat when donations dried up. Why would you never tell me? Ajax crossed the room slowly and knelt down beside her, among the scattered papers. Because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything. Not affection, not gratitude, not marriage. I made a promise to myself after my father died that I would help your mother however I could, quietly, without ever expecting anything in return. When our families arranged our marriage, I was terrified you'd think everything I felt for you was somehow tied to old debts and guilt, instead of something real. Ajax! Romilly's voice broke, tears finally spilling over, as months of careful distance between them crumbled completely. This isn't guilt. This is the truest thing anyone has ever done for my family. You've loved us both quietly for years, and I nearly missed it, because I was so afraid to believe someone like you could ever choose someone like me. I didn't choose you out of obligation, Ajax said fiercely, reaching up to cradle her face gently between his hands. I chose you because somewhere between arranged papers and empty formality, I fell in love with the woman who picks locks to save shelters and stands in front of bulldozers without blinking. I fell in love with you, Romilly, completely, terrifyingly, and I have been too afraid to say it out loud until this exact moment. The last remaining wall between them finally shattered completely. Romilly closed the distance, her hands finding the collar of his shirt, and when their lips met, it carried none of the careful restraint that had defined every moment of their marriage before this. It was raw and honest and long overdue, years of unspoken feeling, finally allowed to breathe. When they finally pulled apart, foreheads resting together amid the scattered papers of a decade's worth of quiet devotion, Ajax whispered against her lips, "Tomorrow, we finish this, together. No more secrets between us, not from Genevieve and not from each other." Romilly nodded, her heart finally, fully whole, for the first time in years. Together. The Imperial Exhibition Center blazed with light that evening, its grand hall packed with donors, board members, and press from every major outlet in the city. Banners overhead read Ashcroft Foundation Annual Summit, though by the time the night ended, that name would mean nothing at all. Genevieve stood at the podium in a gown of deep crimson, her voice smooth and confident as she addressed the crowd. "Tonight marks a new chapter for our foundation's future," she announced, gesturing toward a large screen behind her displaying renderings of luxury developments where St. Jude's shelter once stood. A bold step toward modernization, one that honors our legacy while securing our finances for generations to come. Applause rippled through the room, polite and uncertain, most attendees unaware of the storm quietly closing in around her. The doors at the back of the hall opened. Ajax walked in first, composed and immaculate in a black suit, Romilly beside him in deep navy silk, her chin held high, flanked by a team of lawyers and, unexpectedly, 2 armed marshals carrying official court seals. Whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire as they made their way down the center aisle. Genevieve's smile faltered at the podium. "This is a private event." "Not anymore," Ajax said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the silent hall. He climbed the small stage steps without hesitation, Romilly close behind him. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, but you deserve to know exactly what you're applauding tonight." A large screen beside Genevieve's presentation flickered, and Priya's financial documents began appearing one by one. The laundered accounts, the forged lease agreements, the rerouted donations traced through Genevieve's shell companies over the past decade. "Every dollar donated to this foundation for the past 10 years, Ajax continued, was funneled through fraudulent venue leases controlled by Lady Genevieve Ashcroft, generating profit for her private accounts, while charities like St. Jude's Women's Shelter were slowly bled dry. Genevieve's face drained of color. "This is a fabrication, slander meant to destroy." "It's not fabrication," a new voice interrupted from the side of the stage. Every head turned as Marcus Vale stepped forward, still dressed in his security uniform, a folder clutched in his hands. Romilly's breath caught in surprise. The last time she'd seen him, he'd been chasing her through a parking garage. "I worked security for the Ashcroft family for 6 years," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the tension radiating through the room. "3 nights ago, I was arrested trying to break into a private residence on Lady Ashcroft's orders. Facing federal charges tends to clarify a man's priorities." He held up the folder. "These are internal communications, proving Lady Ashcroft knowingly ordered the forged sale of St. Jude's shelter, along with instructions to intimidate Mrs. Romilly Windrow into silence." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Genevieve stumbled back from the podium, her composure finally cracking completely. "You ungrateful! I'm done being loyal to someone who almost got me sent to prison covering her crimes," Marcus said flatly, handing the folder to the marshals waiting nearby. Ajax stepped forward, taking control of the room once more. "As of this morning, Cascade Holdings has completed acquisition of 100% of the debts, mortgages, and venue leases previously controlled by Ashcroft Enterprises." He turned slightly, addressing Genevieve directly now. "Every property you thought you owned, every asset you plan to liquidate, belongs to my company. Which means, effective immediately, you have no authority left within this foundation." Genevieve's carefully constructed empire collapsed in real time before 300 witnesses and a dozen television cameras. Security guards, the same ones who once answered only to her, stepped forward at Ajax's signal, gently but firmly escorting her from the stage as she shouted protests that grew quieter with every step toward the exit. Once the doors closed behind her, silence settled over the stunned crowd. Ajax turned to Romilly, and for the first time all evening, something softened in his expression. "This foundation," he said, addressing the room once more, "was built decades ago on the values of one woman. Eleanor Windrow believed that every person, regardless of circumstance, deserved dignity, safety, and a place to call home." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a heavy brass key alongside a folded document bearing the foundation's official seal. "Tonight, I'm restoring this foundation to the family who built it, with honesty from the very beginning." He turned to Romilly, extending both the master deed and an ornate ceremonial gavel toward her trembling hands. "Romilly Windrow," he said, his voice thick with emotion despite the formal setting. "As rightful heir to your mother's legacy, and as the only person who never once stopped fighting for what was right, even when it would have been easier to give up, I present you full and permanent directorship of this foundation." Romilly's hands closed around the deed, tears blurring her vision as applause finally erupted through the hall, genuine and overwhelming, drowning out every whisper of doubt that had followed her since the night she'd been handed a stained apron and told to know her place. She looked out at the crowd, then back at Ajax, remembering every moment of the past week. The humiliation, the fear, the discoveries that had rewritten everything she thought she knew about her marriage and her family's history. "My mother used to say," Romilly began, her voice steady despite her tears, "that the measure of a person isn't how they treat those who can help them, but how they treat those who can't do anything for them at all." She looked out at the room, at every donor and board member who had once looked past her without a second glance. Starting tonight, this foundation returns to that principle completely. As applause swelled once more, Ajax pulled her close, pressing a soft kiss against her temple, and for the first time since that humiliating night in the Grand Regent's kitchen, Romilly Windrow finally felt exactly where she belonged. Not in a dish pit, but standing, unshakable, exactly where her mother always meant for her to be.